Sojola here. In this video, we'll be basically giving a brief review and an update on the events and the ongoings of the war in Gaza, right? As we all know, the war started on the 7th of October with a surprise attack that was labeled as Al-Aqsa Flood by Hamas, right? Where about 1,200 Israelis were killed and about 250 were taken hostage by Hamas. Then, what followed after that was a retaliation from the IDF, right, which is the Israeli Defense Forces, particularly using an air campaign. There was an air campaign for about 3 weeks, which targeted particularly northern Gaza, right, and central Gaza, which is known as Gaza City. Now, when you look deep into the air campaigns, right, they are of a twofold nature, right? Firstly, the air campaigns is to destroy the fortifications and military installations that Hamas has dug in all around Gaza, right? But the main reason there was air campaigns that started from the northern side of Gaza, right, to the central part of Gaza was to fundamentally displace the Palestinians towards the south. Now, after displacing and basically pushing um, the Palestinians towards the south, they started with a ground offensive, which is basically soldiers on the ground, tanks going basically street to street, building to building, trying to take over and remove certain installations that Hamas has installed. They also tried to find tunnels and destroy them in the process. There has been heavy fighting, particularly in northern Gaza and central Gaza, where you find Gaza City, right? There were a number of fortified tunnels that the Hamas fighters built, which managed to somehow help them to fight against the ongoing ground offensive by the IDF. Now, the next area to be targeted by the IDF, right, is an area that is known as Dair al-Balha, right, which basically hosts the famous hospital known as the Al-Aqsa Hospital. This hospital was believed to have tunnels which basically connected it to the greater Hamas tunnels, right, that you find in the greater Gaza, right? So this was the next area which was targeted. There were bombings, shellings, right? And particularly targeting of civilians. As we all know, this targeting of civilians is just to push the displaced Palestinians, right, further towards the south, right, and to particularly remove them from central Gaza. Khan Yunis was the next area to feel the wrath of the IDF air campaign and ground campaign. But here there were particularly two tragic events that occurred. The first one is basically the bombing of a refugee camp by IDF, basically claiming that Hamas militants are running into these refugee camps, right, of the displaced Palestinians and hiding amongst that. So they started bombing a refugee camp, right? That is quite tragic. The second tragic event, right, occurred around the famous and the biggest hospital that you found in southern Gaza, known as the Nasser or the Nasir Hospital. The tragic event that occurred in this hospital is that the IDF conducted a siege right around this hospital. Now, a siege is an event where the supplies are cut off, right? Nothing can come into the hospital and nothing can basically go out, right? So that's why there were reports of supplies falling short or running short in the Nasir hospital, right? Because of the fears that there might be a similar tunnel system that you find under Nasir Hospital that links um, the hospital to the greater Hamas tunnel system that is built underground. They also bombed a number of other areas within Khan Yanis, right, to basically push the displaced Palestinians further south. Rafah is the last refuge and safe zone for displaced Palestinians. It is believed that about 1.5 million displaced Palestinians are found in Rafah, right? Now, the IDF is currently conducting an air campaign, right, which is filled with bombings and shelling and basically airstrikes, right? And it is basically threatening to start a ground offensive, particularly after Ramadan. Ramadan is on the 10th of March, right? And they saying that if Hamas does not release the hostages that they have, they will actually start a ground campaign, a ground offensive in Rafah. Now, the main reason for the ground offensive, right, that is planned for the 10th of March, Ramadan, is particularly to control an area that is known as the Philadelphia Corridor, right? The Philadelphia Corridor is basically a buffer zone that exists between Egypt and Gaza, right? When I say Egypt, it's particularly an area known as Sinai. Egypt is currently reinforcing its border using concrete walls, and it is particularly planning to move its military towards or close to the border to prevent any humanitarian catastrophe spilling over onto its territory. Now, Egypt is quite a stable government and it is quite a friendly government in regards to certain wars which break out in its neighbors. For example, Egypt took in refugees, right, from the war in Libya, right? It's currently taking displaced individuals from Sudan, right? And it has been taking a few Palestinians which were basically fleeing into Egypt, right? But Egypt does not believe that it can handle the humanitarian crisis, right? That will occur after the ground offensive that the IDF is planning. Now, there's always been tunnels, right, between Egypt and Gaza, right, which were used for mostly transporting weapons and certain commercial products and even citizens and individuals. Now, Rafah is quite tragic because after Rafah, the Palestinians literally have nowhere to go. They can't go further south because there'll be an incursion into trespassing basically into another country, particularly Sinai, right? Now, we must all fundamentally understand why is Israel doing all of this pushing of the Palestinians towards the south, right? The plan was always to drive Palestinians towards Sinai, right? To particularly move out of Gaza, right? And Egypt doesn't necessarily want this. That's why it's basically building and reinforcing this war to prevent this humanitarian crisis from occurring, right? But what will cause the ultimate destruction is the ground offensive, which is planned to occur on the 10th of March, 2024.